the September 26th, can't believe it's in September, Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Board meeting. We'll begin, as is our habit, with the pledge. Yep. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Would you like me to call the roll?
I'm sorry?
I'll call the roll.
Yes, I think maybe we should.
Melissa.
Present.
Matt.
Present.
Michael.
Present.
Ann.
Present.
Jesse. Not present. I think, did you pass out agendas? Yes. Okay. So, as you know, this group is meeting as the Bicycle Pedestrian Master Plan Task Force as well. Agendas, minutes have been coming from HWC, our consultant, and we'll do so until we actually meet to adopt said plan, or at least recommend that it be adopted by the council and added into the comprehensive plan by the Plan Commission. And I'll tell you, I've been through so many of these plans in my career, and I've seen the public meetings, and I've never seen one go as well as what happened 2 Friday nights ago. You were there. It was quite amazing to see how many people interacted with the consultants in the tent. Now, I guess the flying toasters don't always play at every single public charrette for a rather boring master planning process. So we've learned our lesson, and Nathan and I will certainly try to pull that off again in other plans, such as the Parks Master Plan, as we move forward. So, Corey, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the compliment on that, because I thought it was a really good event the other night. What we want to do is, tonight, we want to go back and look at public input, not just what happened at the Flavor Fest event, but what also we got from our online survey. And then from there, we want to start to really dig into some more details. We've got the updated maps of what we're working on, both in terms of the long-term plan, but kind of zoomed in on the area where we think it's more likely that there's some short-term improvements that would need to be made. And so we want to focus a little bit, and I guess probably most of the conversation beyond just what input we've had, into what does that look like in terms of an action plan of what do we want to do as a result of this. And part of the input that I'll be asking from you guys later in this conversation is, we don't want to just make this about projects. This is also about some of the policies, some of what kind of guidance you guys are looking for in terms of what is your role moving forward and how can we help inform that as we go through this process. And so those are kind of the conversations that we would like to have from here. I think the place to start is let's start with a conversation about the input that we got from the survey. So I'm going to let Chris kind of go through the input from the survey, and then we'll bring it back to the other one.
I'm not as tall as Corey. We had, the first time I looked at the survey was about a week ago, and we had about 350 people that had completed it, and as of today, we had almost 500 people. So I think we got the word out a little bit more with the Flavor Fest event, and there was quite a spike in the number of people that filled it out. There were basically 4 main points that we got from it. The first is that people don't want to share space with cyclists. They want cyclists to have their own space. They want separated multi-use trails. And they want the bicyclists off the road. Now, that may not be what is possible in most cases, but it is good to know people are looking for more multi-use trails. The second thing is that people want access to the commercial activity that's happening on Whitestown Parkway. They want to get from the Legacy Corps down to the commercial activity, but they don't necessarily want to be on the main roads to do that. So back ways, back roads that lead behind the commercial activity, and other paths that go through neighborhoods. They would like to see something along Main Street, but we all know that that's a difficult prospect. So the good news is that people in general do want to see other alternatives to get north to south. So that was actually a combination. People want to get to commercial, and they want to get to and from the legacy core to the commercial. And then the other biggest thing I saw was that people recognize there's a ton of gaps within the sidewalks and within the trail systems, and they just want that connected. They want to get from neighborhood to neighborhood to visit friends, and they want to be able to get to the different parks. I did hear that people are unhappy that the sidewalks are either missing or in bad shape in the legacy core. They want to be able to get from the legacy core neighborhood up to Lions Park, and that's not possible with the gaps in the sidewalks. So those were the main points that we saw. We also recognize there was a lot of venting that happened in the public survey, so people were unhappy about very specific things, but in general, it was kind of the results we expected as far as the feedback that we got.
What questions you guys have on the survey that we have?
We have enough response, you think, for consensus?
I think for 500 responses is a pretty good rate for a kind of a focused survey attempt. 500 responses is really good. So yes, I think it gives us good information. And then when we combine that with the information we got verbally, I think it gives us a pretty good feel for what the pulse of the community really is. One of the things that we did, was part of that Chris didn't mention, is we literally went through that and said, okay, where are the problem areas? And people wrote in, this intersection is bad, this intersection is hard. And those were, for the most part, the same things that you had identified in early meetings. I don't think there's really anything too different, except for we just got more response and more consensus on those as we move that forward. So I thought that was very helpful as well, and we'll use that as we dive into some of the real details as we go a little further. Other questions on the survey?
No, I didn't have any yet.
Take a look through that and let us know if there's questions or response. We'll update that again towards the end of this as we get any more feedback on it, but we certainly, with 500 responses, feel pretty good about it covering it. The other way that we sought public input on this was to go out and at the Flavor Fest, we set up a booth and we talked to a lot of people. We had some good assistance, and it was fun. I thought it really worked out well. What was interesting about that is that, and I appreciate the folks who are out here tonight, but a lot of people don't come to these meetings, and so what we heard from who we heard from was just as interesting as anything, and that was we saw a lot of families out, we saw a lot of couples with young children, we saw a lot of probably recent empty nesters, and so a really good cross-section of people that often aren't the ones that come to your public meetings, but they were telling us a lot of the same things, but we did hear a few things that kind of stood out, and so there's a summary of those key ones on this handout. The first one was really that people wanted to see neighborhoods connect to the Big Four Trail. What we'd been talking about in this committee was a little bit different. What we talked about in this committee was connecting from neighborhoods to the commercial areas. But what people said is we want to get to the Big Four Trail and then be able to ultimately go places with it. And whether that's just regional biking for recreational purposes, I don't think we heard necessarily we want to commute to it, but the ability to get to the Big Four and go out. So it's not just connect south, but that north-south connection that connects north to the Big Four was really important to people. We heard a lot of people say, why have you not extended the Big Four Trail out further? Well, that's as far as your corporate limits will allow you to do it. You've done your job. Now it's to partner with everybody else to get it extended regionally, but it's outside your direct control. So that was one of the common things that we had to explain to people as we went through the evening. And that kind of makes sense. People don't always understand where those boundaries start and stop. The other thing that we heard a lot of was this need that Main Street and 300 are great roads for cars, but they're not great roads if you're trying to walk or bike, but those are really the primary routes. So we heard from a lot of road cyclists through the evening. We heard several. They said they will avoid both of those roads consistently. And I think we've kind of talked about the same sort of conversation with this group, but it really reinforced it. The conversation was, it's not just that those roads are busy, it's that those roads are not well designed for biking at all. Number one, there's not a separated area for a bike to go to. There's not a trail along a lot of portions of this, but there's not even shoulders. And that's what we kind of heard from several people is, if you just went into some of these roads and provided a shoulder, it just becomes a lot more usable for them. And so that kind of plays into the third point I make here about some of the roadway geometry, just making sure that we look at the design of roads to make sure that they do accommodate walking and biking as best as you can, especially from the bicyclists. One of the things that I have heard here a lot that has caught our attention is there are a lot of road cyclists that we've talked to in this process. There's a lot of people that want to get out of the core of the community and out into the county roads in Boone County to ride. And I think several of you guys on the committee are that way. But we heard a lot of that of people that came out. So this is very much a plan that needs to not just think about where are we going to do for trails, but how do we make sure that we're serving that need for the road cyclists that are trying to get out to those county roads and find safe places to ride out there as well. The other one that took a lot of conversation, we saw a lot of pins on the boards, was that we heard a lot of people saying bike and pedestrian-friendly crossing for I-65 somewhere. They just said the current crossings aren't great, and there's a lot of people that want to get down there. So I don't think that's a real big surprise, but we had a lot of people say, hey, if we could just get down the Indianapolis Road, there's places we can come and go from there. And so we want to kind of bring that back up as a continuing theme in this. You can see in some of the handouts the pictures of what we did to get this input. The boards that we provided, we gave people the opportunity to put a pin on the board where they're trying to bike, where they're starting and where they'd like to go to. So we put pins on schools, we put pins on businesses, we put pins on shopping areas, we put pins to cross I-65, and that was a lot of what started the conversation for us in so many of those. And then you'll see a lot of post-it notes stuck up there or lines drawn just where there were specific issues. But we had a lot of really good input from this, and just good conversation that I think really helped form where we're heading. What questions could we answer about that? Other thoughts on that public meeting?
Is there a way to know, like, the ones that you said there was a need, you know, they preferred having multi-use trails, dedicated bikeways. Do we know what group of people that's coming from mostly? Is it heavy bikers and pedestrian, you know, people that use it quite often now, or is it less frequent?
We can do some isolation of some of the data to better answer that question. I don't think we've gotten to that level of detail with the survey analysis yet. Some of the new data, we just haven't reanalyzed it.
But from some of the comments that I read, it was coming from all across the board. From
Okay.
people who felt too crowded on the sidewalks to have cyclists there, and they've had encounters with cyclists on the sidewalks, and then motorists just driving through town that are upset about the cyclists on the road. So it was coming from a lot of different people.
We did get enough survey responses from people that really don't walk and bike that tend to skew some of the results. So that is something that we've got to pay attention to as we really detail out the survey results and finish that full analysis to make sure which groups of people, and we can isolate the data to tell us a little bit more about that.
And then something like the access to the county roads, and knowing that 650 is challenging, you know, are they open to 575 that's paved and easier to, you know, an alternative route? Did you see that response?
I think that is very much what we heard. Matt, do you agree with that?
Yeah, and you'll notice that on the pictures of the board itself. You know, that red line and reflected several of our comments and conversations with others about that. Absolutely. Yep.
I think what we heard was a preference for Main Street as to where the primary routes should be, but nobody said it should not occur somewhere else for that primary north-south route that we've been talking about.
I think folks, as I talk to folks about the creek, people understand the geographical limitations as we talk with them about it, and some of those issues and concerns. It occurs to me, and forgive me, we're talking about public meeting and hearing from the public, and I notice that we have absolutely the largest group of people who have come out here tonight. I suspect that at least some of them are here because they might like to say something. Since this is an area where we're talking about public meeting and feedback, is anyone opposed to hearing from anybody who'd like to speak at this point? Anyone opposed? Is there anybody that would like to speak to us here, to the board, to our folks who are here, who are gathering feedback for us as a town? Come on up if you would. If you would tell us your name and, thank you. If you tell us your name and describe your interest, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. A little short. My name is Leanne McKay, and I am one of the owners of eBoom Electric Bicycles that is across the street on Whitestown Parkway. I have Robin Kaufman here, the other owner, and Adam Martin, our service manager. And we have a great interest in bike and pedestrians, of course. We feel that we are part of the biking community here and want to continue to be such. We're not just electric bikes. And we hear a lot from our riders about, we want to do group rides because it's a nice community thing, and we want to do a family ride night where it's not just adults but kids that ride as well with us. And it has been very challenging to find a safe route, of course, in the growing area of Whitestown. So in doing that, we do have a vested interest in the new routes and what's going to go on. And we've ridden a lot ourselves out there, so we have a lot of feedback. And I encouraged a lot of our customers to take the poll online.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it was really good. But safety, I think, is one of the main things, of course, that we're involved in. Matter of fact, we had a customer who hit a car this morning. Luckily, she was not injured badly or anything. And it's awareness on both sides, as you know. It's the bicyclists being aware and courteous to the cars and the pedestrians, and vice versa. So I guess in our thing, we'd like to. I understand the financial challenges. I understand the route challenges. And we ride Main Street a lot to LA Cafe. It's fun. It's fun to go to LA Cafe. And we'll ride out there, and the cars get aggravated at us. We don't hog the lane. We all try to stay on the side. But because there is not anywhere to go except down in the woods. So I think as Whitestown grows down there, I forget the legacy. As the legacy continues to grow there, it's going to be important to get people from here to there and there to here somehow. And then I think the last thing I wanted to suggest on that is that there are alternate routes. I mean, right now we get to Zionsville, we had to get creative, and we ride partially on Whitestown. Well, we ride the path over here as far as we can until it ends. And then we get on Whitestown Parkway, we get a little bit of a shoulder, about this much. Then you ride to 800, where the light is, and then you go down there, up and down, it's beautiful. And then we go on Hunt Club Road, which is really, except for rush hours, really not traveled much. And then we ride into Ford Road and into downtown Zionsville. So that, when the path opens, that'll be a great way to go safely. But I think the challenge, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, no, this Main Street might not work, but there are other ways to get people there, like you said. It's going to be education and information and communication, et cetera. So I guess the gist of my rambling up here is that we're here to back you guys, and we want to help make this great for the community as much as we can.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let us know about group ride nights.
I will. We're going to do some fall ones,
Yeah. There might be a way that we can partner in that. Thanks. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, that would be great. Because, as I said, we don't want to limit it to, and we have different levels of riders, of course. We have more experienced riders who want to go fast, and we'll put Adam on them. And then we have riders who want to, take it easy and see the countryside. And then, as I said, we have family riders. Kids want to ride too. So we want to make it fun for everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And we definitely partner with you on that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is there anybody else that came to speak with us? Oh. Oh, goodness.
Hi, I'm Robin Kaufman. I'm the other owner of eBoom. I just want to say our clientele, it's a group that hasn't really been riding bikes much, right? So they're just getting back into bike riding. They're riding their e-bikes. They don't know, they don't understand the dangers necessarily that are out on the roads. And as that increases more and more, we can't forget about those people that are coming back into riding, because that's what's going to happen. And so I know we've got a lot of data and we want to focus on the people who are riding bikes a lot, but don't forget about that other group that's going to be re-entering the segment again. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that will happen more as we grow. It'll happen more out here. So anyway, thank you. Thanks for all your hard work.
Yeah. I'll also mention, since you talk about keeping things in mind, one of our, I guess, guiding principles in the town has asked us to do is not just to be about bikes either. Is to really think about folks who want to walk and that ability to be close there too. And so we want to make sure that we consider that element of safety and the different approach to distance as well. Perhaps there are those folks who would walk the length of Main Street. I am not one of them. That's pretty long. So it's just a different way that we might consider some things. Thank you. Sir, I believe you have your hand up.
Yeah. So just a brief comment, basically a word of appreciation to the Parks and Rec Department. Mm-hmm. So the new trail, so I live in Eagles Nest Boulevard, Eagles Nest neighborhood, sorry. My name's Jonathan Sims, I don't know if I said that. So I've been very appreciative of that trail that now goes north up to Traders Point Christian Church. Any way we can get that extended or get more miles on that side, I can tell you people will appreciate it. I was counting as I was on a run this morning, there were 7 of us that counting myself, that I passed at 6:30 this morning. So people are heavily using it. I think there's rarely a time I drive by that I don't see someone on that trail. So just a word of support and thank you for that. And I think that feeds into this whole larger plan. So that's where my interest comes in tonight. I did a run over this weekend across I-65 just to see what that was like. Didn't tell my wife before I did it. It wasn't too bad, actually. I went to Starbucks. That was my halfway point. I went to Starbucks and got some chocolate-covered espresso beans and a water and ran back. So I think finding a way, and I understand that potentially has to happen in conjunction with the State Department, correct? As we think about how to actually do that. But I think having some way to bridge that would be a really cool thing to have, and I think would be a draw to people. And as I've started thinking about that and the idea of there potentially being more of a draw to this area, because you'll see the cyclist all the time on Indianapolis Lafayette Road right there. Thinking about Whitestown becoming a potential draw, I think there's potentially a really cool site with Old Perryworth Road and how that feeds into that corridor being, I know it's right along I-65, but if you're looking for mileage or you're looking for a good place to put a trail and potentially connecting up to the Big 4 trail to give you expansive number of miles, I think that would be a really neat window. You kind of see that in the West. If you go out west and you're traveling, you'll see they have more of a focus on recreation. And they'll have some of these places where you can pull off and park a car that's actually not that far from a major corridor, a major thoroughfare. And they'll have that because that's a big part of society out there in a lot of these towns. So just a few thoughts and words of appreciation to the Parks Department for what's been done so far.
Thank you. Thank you.
Street Department as well.
Is there anyone else at this point? Well, thank you all for coming as well, and we'll return then, I guess, to our agenda.
Well, I think all of those are appropriate comments, and I guess I'm specifically interested. Make sure we get a connect afterwards, because I'd like to talk about where you do your group rides. Where does that look like right now, and what are some of those gaps that are missing that impact that? Because I think that it's really important to remember, as they said, that there are so many different people at different stages in cycling, and we need to be able to provide routes that are good for the hardcore road rider as well as the person who's just starting and, as I said, getting back into it. So I think these are all really important comments. What we want to talk through based on this now, I guess any other questions on public comment before we kind of jump into some of the other parts of tonight's agenda? Okay. What we want to do from here is the way we've approached the map, and to get everybody else in the room up to speed on this, we do have a couple of maps up here. And feel free to get up and take a look at these as we're talking. Don't worry too much about that. What we've looked at in terms of the mapping that you're seeing in front of you is, this is a long-term vision of, if money's no object and a developer builds everything, where would we want trails to be in a 20-year vision for the community? And what we thought from this was, this is the appropriate place to start a trails conversation of what does a network of trails ultimately look like in 20 years at a full build-out. And with that, what we want to do is get consensus on where we'd like to ultimately go, and then use that to backfeed into this conversation of where do we start. And so the map that you see in front of you here, if it's in the blue, that is a new proposed trail. If it is in green, those are your existing trails. And then there are several sections in red on this, and those sections in red are places that are outside your corporate limits. So those are suggested routes that ultimately are going to take partnership with entities outside Whitestown to make those connections. And those become pretty important to the success of this plan in the end, because you cannot make every connection that you'd like to make within your corporate limits. So as we look at that, some of these are along major roadways, and then some of these are along some of the creeks and riparian areas in the district. So while those may not be wooded creek sides, those are still in a lot of places have a nice tree row against them. Those can become really nice places. One of the comments that we heard during the public input that I thought was really interesting is, I talked to one family, said, it's really hard to ride our bikes with our young kids because this is a new community and so much has been built in cornfields. There's no shade. And so you get a hot summer day and it's tough for a young family, to bike if it's all out in the sun the whole way. And they said, even within our neighborhood, sometimes we'd get in the car to go to the pool because it's just in the heat of the summer, it's too much. And so I think the more we think about the tenets of walkability and bikeability, finding places with shade is as important of a characteristic on will that area be used as is it safe. So is it comfortable and is it safe? Both have to factor into it. So as you look at this map, I think the first priorities that we have is how do you ultimately create that north-south connection. That really becomes, I think, the basics of what we've got to do is understand what is that north-south connection. And in this master planning, what we've said is it's not just one north-south route. We think ultimately that you need both the Main Street route as well as the route on 575. We think these are dual goals that you would want both of those in the long term. We may invest, and I think that's part of the stage 2 of this conversation, we may want to look at one of those being more enhanced, one of those may have more pedestrian amenities on it, and one of them may be a little bit more utilitarian. That's, I think, the input that we need, but we really are coming up with this idea that we need two north-south corridors. The other benefit of two north-south corridors is looping so that you don't have to go 5 miles out and back. If you want a 1 mile loop, there are shortcuts and there are circuits that you can take, and we think that really provides some nice benefit to that. So that's, I think, the primary focus of where we've taken this map as we work through it. Does that make sense to everybody? Are we all on board with that idea? Chris, what else changed on this map from what they've seen before? Really has not changed much.
It hasn't changed a whole lot. There's been some adjustments, just some minor adjustments on where this
575
route comes down. We spoke to some folks about where certain developments are happening, where some property lines are, and to try to figure out what the best route to take this down. Because I know at one point we talked about coming down into a neighborhood, but we think that perhaps staying outside of the neighborhood is better. So just some adjustments like that that we made. Also, the main route along Whitestown Parkway, we've kind of taken that off for now. We can talk about that some more, but instead we've focused more on coming back behind that development, some more off major road access to these commercial centers.
Does that make sense with Whitestown Boulevard? Because that's kind of some of the input was we should have a trail along every major roadway, but the challenge with Whitestown Boulevard with the amount of traffic that it has, do we really want to promote that as a connection, or since there are back routes just parallel to it, is that adequate? So that's some of the input that we're thinking about.
I have almost no fear, really, when it comes to riding. I have to go between the little pathway to get to 800 to take my riders. I really want to go on a long test ride. I'm literally 4 feet away from the cars on Western Parkway, and I am okay with that. People that I want to take a test ride on are not. When going south or go east on Western Parkway, in between Lowe's and going up this way and then turning right on the corner, there's a pathway that you can get down to over by this school, the kids' school, and then that goes until it just ends. It literally just ends in grass. That should be continued over at least up to the light to make any of that safe. Because when I take people, and it's not just for me to do this, it's for anybody that wants to. It's inside that Con Club area. It would be very beneficial for anybody.
Science.
So you're in a park for the neighboring municipality.
Science.
That trail ends.
Yeah, that's why that.
You did Zions, okay. Whitestown Parkway is ended, Oak Street has begun, and down Zions. I've talked to Mayor Hawkins a couple of times. They know that Oak Street is a priority. About $30 million.
Yeah.
Works.
Yeah.
Nobody has.
It's
No municipality in the state of Indiana has $30 million.
No.
We don't. Well, Mayor Brady. You're right. I actually ran 2 weeks ago. I ran into the village on a long run and ran down Oak Street. Like, that was nothing. It is a scary move to do, and I ride as well. I've ridden that. So, but we know, we've talked to our neighbors, we've talked to our neighbors.
Well, it's good to know that that's where the line is now.
And we've talked to our neighbors and said, hey, Nathan and I, we even approached our Congress, talking to our congressman about doing a big tiger grant to do a trail all the way down Whitestown Parkway, all the way down Oak Street, from Whitestown to the Village.
I don't know if that's the best connection, like you said. It does, it's super busy.
You can do it, it's just going to cost about $10 million. It's going to cost about $10 million.
So, as we look at alternatives to Main Street, is Zionsville open to to alternatives to Whitestown Parkway or Oak Street? I mean, going up to 550, I bike 550 to work. Would they ever be open to something like that? And
I think if, they're not here to speak for themselves, and I appreciate both towns and their ability and interest in having those conversations. I suspect that perhaps part of what we might be interested in proposing is further conversation to that end. But it is a larger regional, even as we look at neighboring community in Lebanon, and when we talk about the Big Four, we have to also talk about the county and making that connection. There are a lot of moving parts in all this. I appreciate that we're talking about 20-year vision. I suspect that some of it may not be accomplished in 20 years, but I'm hopeful. You don't get it done if you don't get started.
Well, and I think part of the conversation that we've had in the office is you guys are a relatively new board, what is your role in some of these conversations? And when you have only so much that you can do within your corporate limits, there's a portion of a role that may involve advocacy for some of the projects that extend beyond the corporate limits, and that to me is a important function that somebody's got to carry. And staff can do a portion of that, but getting that where it's more grassroots effort than just staff is going to be critical to seeing those things done. I think some of the things that you've heard tonight is some of the programming side of it becomes a role just as important as that. Is how do you start to train new riders? How do you start to facilitate some of those group rides that give people that first experience? All these things kind of fit together into a big conversation of, if you want to have a community that is one of the most walkable and bikeable places in Indiana, it takes more than just infrastructure. It takes advocates, it takes partners that are businesses, it takes people that care to come to public meetings and support trails. It takes all those things. Well, I guess the ultimate question then is, let's take a look at so we've got a 20-year vision of generally what we're trying to do. What we'd like to start to do is say, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and say, what is from an infrastructure perspective, what is the number one priority that we want to accomplish? And I'll open it up for conversation from you guys of the infrastructure things that do not exist right now. Where do you see project number one? And what we've done on this is we've got a little bit of a zoomed in map, because I think as we look at this, really the connection between I-65 and Legacy Core becomes where most of the conversations that we've had are. There's a lot of other areas that are beyond that. Please do whatever.
They have all this.
They have. You guys all have that, so please take a look at that. Please. So you're right here. This is coming all the way up here's Main Street. This is the Legacy Core. This is the B&O. This is Whitestown Parkway. It still says 334. State of Indiana GIS.
550 right here. The 550 runs to the north of Lateral West, east and west.
Yeah, we've been talking about two different roads, 550 and 575. 575 is parallel to Main Street.
No, there was here.
The one that was just paid was at 500.
500 was just paid this year. Ferry Works was paid last year, and 575 was paid 3 years.
Yeah, that was 500.
That was 500.
That 50 feet of pavement was pretty awesome, by the way.
The connector? It's Alvarez Way. It actually has been named, it's now it's the extension of Alvarez Way. Up to 300. And I was going through some old records in my office today, and the Whitestown Council sent a note to the county. It's a county road project, which then will become the Whitestown Road. Sent a note to the county asking them why a trail was taken out of the project. So there is the county is not building trails on either side of the connector, and we were very concerned about why did you take that out of the project when it was in there, and are you leaving us any right-of-way to build one? It would have been nice, because Alvarez Way, as it goes west, has trail, nice trail all the way to the interstate. It's a mistake on the county's part. They should have, and if they would have built to Whitestown standards, we have a complete streets ordinance. If you build a street here, you have to build trails on either side of the roadway. So it's something that got lost and shuffled. Also, the Ronald Reagan. In 2010, the Whitestown Council sent emails to NDOT during the charrette process, the public hearing process, and stated, why are there not trails all the way from Brownsburg along the Ronald Reagan up to the Boone County portion? And the question was never answered, and there still aren't trails designed into that project either. So we want to be a voice of reason and make sure that those things don't continue to happen. Because adding that to the fact, when the economies of scale cost money, cost a lot of money.
Mr. Norton, perhaps useful here to the board. Thank you. Just handed the Mr. Messer handed the engineer's report on the pedestrian bridge over I-65.
Give the public a number?
I'll share it here with the board as well.
Down first?
Yes, sure thing. It's pretty remarkable. Total project development cost would be estimated at $6.7 million to get us over I-65, and it looks to me as though that is just, that's right at around the TA, so just right there at the Whitestown Parkway on-off ramp. So I'll share this with board members up here. We'll make sure we
There's
get back
also
to you.
another proposal to get across I-65, a separate bridge.
So the midpoint interchange is probably going to be the most realistic way to build pedestrian access over I-65 at this point, because it's going to be built likely prior to exit 130 being blown up and reconstructed. So that would be it, and exit 133 are both going to be it's going to be built, and 133 is going to be rebuilt at the same exact time. So I've seen the design for both, and both have pedestrian access over. So if you go to Greenwood or Carmel, actually it's Noblesville, Campus Parkway, seen exit 210. It's a divergent diamond that has, I believe, the pedestrian access that actually runs right down the middle of the lanes. So it's pretty neat how it's done. Greenwood's that way. Yes, Greenwood's diverging diamond is that way, and the pedestrian access is right smack down the middle of the interstate bridge, which I like. I like that's done on the other side. And that would be the design that's done at the midpoint interchange. The exit 133 redesign is a cloverleaf, which means we could just extend the Alvarez White trails up and over. We're not trying to
is that what they were?
Thunder. He can correct me anytime he wants to.
Is that what you guys were proposing, the last meeting we had, where you had access over the freeway? I forgot what your proposal was.
Well, we talked about, there's three or four strategies. I mean, you're either going to do it where you've got existing crossings now and tie it in as you retrofit it, you're going to put it in at this midpoint, or you're building a dedicated pedestrian crossing. So you've got multiple options. By far, your most cost-effective route, as we look at it right now, is going to be use that midpoint interchange as priority one. Now, I think this plan as a 20-year strategy may still call for, it certainly is going to call for making sure there's pedestrian accommodation whenever these other two interchanges are done. So that needs to be part of this plan. And I think it's still appropriate to say a mid to long-term goal is a dedicated pedestrian crossing. Because no matter what you do, when you have a pedestrian crossing that is at the same place where you have vehicular traffic, unless you spend a lot of money to completely separate those, it's not an ideal crossing for ideal pedestrian bike connectivity across the interchange. Getting something that is completely separated, like the project that you're talking about, is by far the best thing to do, but you pay a significant price to get that luxury.
Corey, I think Nathan's plan needs to be in this one, because his plan is to go do an 80-20 project, assuming the Congress does eliminate there's an amendment that does eliminate that process right now in the current budget. Let's cross our fingers on that amendment stays that doesn't make it to the floor. But assuming the 80-20 federal project stays in, you'll see that our match is $2.2 million, something like, so the local match is $2.2 million, the rest comes from the federal government. That call, Nathan and I were talking, we think that call is like 2022, 2023. So federal money is 2017. If they made it, the next call will probably be early next year, 2018, for money to be allotted and given to us 5 years later. That's what happened with the roundabout at Indianapolis Road, Whitestown Parkway. I hear all the time, where you guys plan that, where's the money? It's an 80-20 project, the federal government gives it to you about 5 years in arrears. And so that's the same thing that would do. I certainly think that needs to be in the mix to have a dedicated pedestrian. Now there's switchbacks. You're not you're carrying your bike. Picking your bike up, you're carrying it.
It's a safe way to do that. Sometimes,
Yes.
sometimes it's a safe way to do that. Yep. So, at the risk
Anybody
of
else have any clarification of this?
Question is related or not. So 20 years, I mean, I sit here and go, wow, 20 years, a lot of things change, technology, dollar,
That's our next conversation.
That's the question he just asked before I got up and interrupted. He asked you all and this board and staff, what is the first number one product? Now, you got to remember a 20-year plan that we update about every 3 years. So, and a 20-year plan is likely going to come in with, what, 60 million? Maybe 30 million?
I mean, it's going to be a significant amount of money, but the goal with a 20-year plan is to look at this and say, these are all the things that we want. And developers, as you're putting your work in, you build as many of these as you can. And so we're trying to set this up so that, especially these areas that are not where we're zoomed in right now, you know, if that develops, the developers put it in, and so it doesn't have to be a cost that every taxpayer has to pay. It's tied into the cost of new people coming in. But we've also got to look at what is not going to be done by developers that becomes the priorities that we need to get done. And so let me throw out a couple examples of what I think are key priorities that do not get addressed by developers in the short term. One of those is going to be any type of a connection up to, from Walker Farm up to the Big Four. So you've got a trail in front of Walker Farms on Main Street, but from there in, it's a combination of sidewalk and nothing, and driveways and other restrictions. That gap in between is not going to be resolved by developers. And if we heard something at our public sessions, it was, we need to close that connection gap up. So that to me is an example of something that from public input we heard was relatively high on the list. The other issue that we consistently heard at the public meeting was this intersection at 500 and Main Street of trying to find some way to close that up. We've got Walker Farms, and then we've got the new subdivision south of, you want to point that out where we're talking about on here. So you got Walker Farms, and then you got to the north, and then the new subdivision at 500. Getting any kind of a connection between those two becomes pretty important through here. Now, does that follow along Fishback Creek, or does that follow along some other routes that we can be looking at in this? That is another example that it'd be ideal for that to be paid by a developer, but if we want to make this north-south connection, where does that occur? Does it occur along Main Street to create that connection, or do we want to follow that on Fishback Creek? Those are the questions, a couple of them that we think come pretty high on the list of what we need to do to get that full connection. I'd love to see a trail all the way north-south along Main Street. Please.
So I hate to interrupt him, but I want to, so we don't go too far on it. The Main Street, we've applied the past 2 years for federal funding for the Main Street Trail. $1.9 million is what we're looking at. We applied for $1.4 million. Both years we have fallen under the point scoring. We're actually setting up, hopefully next week or the following week, to meet with head 1 and 2 at the Andy MPO and a project manager to bring them up here. They've agreed to come up, look at that project, and we hope to submit that one again. So like we said, it'd be 5 years' money, and some things could happen, and we can look at other options. But that is a meeting coming up, and when that comes up, a lot of this information from this survey I think will be crucial in trying to help us build a better application to get that money. And when we have that meeting, if a member of this board would like to, or is available to come to meet with them to help emphasize from that. But that is one we are actively looking at, it and the Indy Road continuation once the roundabout's done, and continuing Indianapolis Road all the way up to 267 at the truck stop.
Do we have
I think one of the hardest parts of both your question and really the entire puzzle is that nearly every aspect of design, at least in my impression of it all, design of a master plan is that plan can change in a moment based on the award of funding, based on a new developer that goes in a particular place, based on very many other things. And so it strikes me that, and I don't know, and I guess I'd ask it this way, as other communities are looking at their master plans, how specific do they speak about these kinds of questions? We all, many of us, myself, many people here, we care about particular pathways that really matter to us, particular locations, and we have our own ideas about, well, the next great alternative would be this. So as we kind of conceptualize and as we kind of get toward the answer to your question about what are priorities, are you asking the question, you know, is it this path or that path? Is it Fishback or is it 575? Or are we speaking more generally about that importance of north-south? I think from my own experience in being a part of these questions and what haven't had time to go through all 48 pages, but my quick overview, I do think that north-south, not only for myself but for our community, is a giant part of what folks desire, look for. It incorporates many of the things that are high priorities for folks, both in neighborhood connections, Big Four connections. There's a lot that goes on with that north-south. So, you know, if we're talking about short-term, that seems a little bit different than in a few months we talk about maybe in 5 years. And so I guess that's part of my question, is how are you framing it, and what kind of specificity does the town need in order to prioritize and develop the rollout or the execution of a plan in both the short and long term?
Well, and sorry, I know it's your, but going on to that, if we go for this and we say, hey, Main Street, which becomes this major thoroughfare north-south, may take 5 years, may take 6 years. Who knows where we're going to get the funding, how we're going to do it. But if we win this, we're 5 years out. In the short term, you could look at those other alternatives that are in the plans. We could apply for a DNR RTP grant and get $150,000 from it. There's other alternatives with those. We could do some of those that are more back, hey, you might have to cut through this neighborhood on a trail, and we're going to build this quarter-mile piece, and then you can make it around, but you're going all this way out of your way, which would get people by for the 5-year period until we're able to do that major thoroughfare. And that's kind of where I'd like to get with the board more on what's out there with grants and options of looking at these. Hey, we can apply for this grant. We have money in 2 years. This grant's 5 years. And piece those together to create those quick Band-Aids to get people where they need to go, but then still have that long-term vision of those major thoroughfares.
Well, then I suppose for myself, in considering both that and all these other pieces, I guess my initial feedback to your question about what would be priority, I really think that 575 is we see it from folks. I think a lot of, in the short term, as we think about, applying for other things and what can be done with Main Street, 575 is I think 575 is an important place. I guess I'd offer that as a point of discussion.
Okay.
In part because we're an hour in here and want to be respectful of folks' time, but also because I think you might get us started toward what are some goals we can articulate in the answer to your question.
Well, and let me kind of come back to your first question, which is, how detailed did you get when you start to set this? And it's a great question, because the best answer we've got is we want to start as broad as we can. Okay? And that's why we looked at a 20-year vision, because you need flexibility in implementation. The funding cycles, the funding programs that we're using can all change with the next federal budget. Okay? We don't know what that's going to do. That's a major factor in this. So we want to start with a 20-year vision, and I'm more interested in coming out of this and saying our priority is a north-south connection. Okay, that's the important thing that I'm really looking for. What we want to do is give you an action plan, though, because if all we do is start to say we want a north-south connection, that doesn't put asphalt on the ground, building trails, building connections, improving conditions. So what we want to do is when you say our priority is to make a connection from Walker Farms to the Big Four, we want to take that and work with these guys to start to apply for that funding that will implement that. And it can look like a bunch of different projects. It doesn't have to be specifically defined, but if you don't have it broad and specific, you're never going to get there. And so there's this weird combination of both that is needed in a plan like this. What I'm most interested in is when we say, here's the 5 things we want to do in the next 5 years, that's really what I want to get to, is what are the basics? We can work on the details from here. That's our job, as kind of your support in this. We'll work through specifically what that looks like. So 575 is great.
North-south.
North-south is a main corridor. Challenge with 575, as we have this conversation, is today it doesn't connect a person. And, with the exception of where 400 comes across, it doesn't connect to other trails. So that's kind of the problem with 575 today.
Sure.
versus making that investment on Main Street. The good thing about 575 is there's not much in the way, so it becomes very easy from that standpoint. 575 is also something that if that comes in, it's easier for a developer to work on that. But how quick is that area going to be developed?
So I guess that's, again, part of my question. So, you know, is that the town's job, is that our town council's job to kind of sift through those details? You know, what level of specificity is the town looking from us? You know, I guess, you know, in sort of my, I don't know if it's counter to the idea that there aren't a lot of people there. We have several major neighborhoods that very easily connect to 575 in a way that's different than 650. On the other hand, we have some major neighborhoods going on the east side of 650, and we don't want to exclude our neighbors there. So perhaps.
Well, I can answer that. Good public policy and good budgeting policy is you fund your priorities, right? We say that you fund your priorities. We've funded the police, we've funded the fire, you're going to be hard pressed to find a bad road to drive on in the town of Whitestown. Be hard pressed to do it. So now it's time to fund these priorities, but you also need to fund the park priorities. So the council needs to look at and make sometimes difficult decisions on how much debt do we go into. A majority of that's probably going to be tax increment finance debt. We could probably do this trail with a special projects bond after the storm sewer project special projects bond is paid off in 2019. So if we don't get federal dollars, we could probably do local dollars. But do we fund the Main Street Trail? Do we fund the 7-acre park, which now has a price tag of about $4 million? Do we fund a park down by a project that we're looking at, a pretty massive project down by Eagles Nest that would bring some recreation into the mix? Probably to the tune of $30 million. Do we? I mean, and so on and so forth. You know, the budget of the town is about $17 million. About $8 million of that goes to fire and police. After that, you've got about $2 million that goes to motor vehicle highway, which is your roads. It costs about $100,000 per lane mile to mill and resurface a road. It cost about $2 million per 3/4, $2.5 million to Perryworth was a good example. It was about 3/4 of a mile of road for $2.5 million to build new. I'm kind of trying to put everything into perspective for you all as you make decisions on what your priorities are, but your job is to tell the council that we are citizens, we are a citizens commission, and as citizens we pay taxes. You listen to us and you're advising them on what should be, they fund their priorities and what their priorities should be from a funding perspective, and then we have to figure out kind of creatively in Indiana from a government perspective on how do you fund those. How do you do that? There are limited tools. The state does not do a good job of giving us home rule to fund these projects, and they even made that worse in 2008 with the tax caps. But we do it, and there are ways to do it, and we just have to go out and we have to know what our priorities are first before we go out and find the funding. So that's what your job is. Okay?
Thank you. Well, so then in thinking about this evening, I know there's still some other items on the agenda, including next steps. What is it that you're looking at from us?
Well, it just comes back to this basic conversation. Where do we start? And what we'd like to do is take these general priorities that we've talked about and start to put them into an action plan that involves both 575 as well as Main Street, creating those connections north to south, defining that into projects, take into consideration what they've already got defined as well as some of these new ideas, and starting to put that into a map in a little bit more detail, but also starting to complement that as to what does that 5-year plan look like. As long as we continue to focus on north-south trail, okay, that's one. That becomes a north-south trail all the way from basically the shopping district all the way up to the Legacy Core with an alternate route, either Main Street or the other. We need to look at all of those options and put that together for you, and then start to tie in this connection across I-65, which becomes the other key short-term priority. If we focus on those two things for a 5-year goal, and maybe it's 5+ when you figure federal funding, those seem to be pretty realistic action strategies for this. If you literally can get a trail the whole way down, north to south, that becomes what seems to be coming out of this as the highest priority in what I'm hearing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I guess, you know, the other, I'm glad you mentioned the other piece in the same sentence, because, you know, a third of our community is separated by that giant artery of 65. I don't know if that's right. It looks like about a third to me. That's a real thing. Thank you for explaining the, you know, the intricacies, the costs, and all of that. But I appreciate those both being in your conversation about 5-year-ish goals.
Okay.
Priorities. I don't wish to dominate the conversation either. Any board members, of course.
If we do agree that north-south is our priority, do we look at alternatives, I mean, involving Fishback as part of that, or is that in conjunction with 575, or?
I think so, because Fishback makes a lot of sense once you get south of Albert S. White, because it's closer to other things, it's a more interesting route. It starts to add those other components that we talk about as being desirable, which is not just a straight long run along a road. It starts to add some meandering. It adds that interest. So that's really what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
So we approach it as both 575 and Fishback at the same time is being developed as a north-south?
That combination of that corridor. So what we kind of talked about is that if you've got one major route here, your other route priority really starts to become following this down in some manner so that it can get down to here. So if you can get down to here, you're close to, you know, number one, an opportunity for a crossing here at 65 long term, but you're also close to a potential mid-block crossing that we can come off of. So there's a lot of flexibility from there in getting either way, depending on which way things go. And that flexibility, I think, is going to be pretty important in making this work. 575 down here probably has less value than bringing this in a little bit more. This still may need to go in, but that's probably more developer-driven than it is right now. And really, if you can get to here, the section from 575 or to Fishback Creek South is probably in the short term a higher priority than coming up here if you can get this connection made. If this connection is hard to fund, this is great as well. So options, show you a couple different routes, we can pull that together and make that work.
North-south.
North-south. With this connection across 65.
To let you guys know what my plan from Parks Input is to do is when you identify these routes, is to create plans like that book that show these and put numbers to them. That way we can sit and actually know what it's going to cost. And then we can also look at the fact of, like we're saying, a lot of this stuff can be developer driven. We'll know what that costs so we can decide, is it worth spending the money, or is it better to, hey, do we want to spend $800,000 to put this piece in now to make the connection? Or do we wait on the developer for that because we'd rather spend the $800,000 to get this done? Because one day this will be developed and done by the developer. So once this plan is done, then we start to put numbers to these and give you an idea of what it's actually going to cost for each of these projects.
And all of the developers will follow the same standard, correct? We won't have different materials or different widths or?
Yes, and this plan will set those guidelines. So for example, showing this bridge across at exit 130, whether that happens, doesn't happen, but that has set that if we want that, so the time comes that that bridge gets a renovation and they take that and redo it or something, that's in there. And then we have a good stance to go in and fight and say, hey, look, you need to add a pedestrian crossing here. This is something we had in the works, it needs done, it's in our plan. So every one of these gets put into play and we can have a good stance to argue with developers of saying, hey, it's in our plan, here's our standard, you need to put this pathway in.
He brings up a great point. I don't know if you saw in the paper that community crossings grants were handed out by NDOT for local communities to get road funding. Whitestown received the highest amount in the county by a pretty substantial number. I think the second highest was $480,000. We received $620,000. We've received feedback from NDOT. We have the most up-to-date and shovel-ready planning, one of the most up-to-date and shovel-ready planning in the state of Indiana. We do it well. Our PASER report is updated annually now, and that's very rare. So this can be the same thing as what Nathan just said. If you hand NDOT and you hand the state plans that are in place and shovel-ready, and they understand that you know exactly what you're doing and your act is together, you're likely going to get a lot more partnership from the governor's office and from NDOT than you would if you did not. So that's going to be a critical component to receiving funding as well. And it may not be funding that we didn't know was coming that'd help us to finance these projects. So.
I'd like to move to next steps in this. Any other questions before we kind of just wrap up with next steps? I don't want to cut anything short, but I do want to make sure
we come back to miscellaneous.
Sure. Great. I think we talked about that a little bit as we were having some of the other conversations, and really I think the question to you is, do you want to see some guidance from us or some suggestions for things like programming as well as some of the advocacy, things that are not necessarily within your control? Does that make sense? Because you guys are a new group, you don't have a lot of formal definition after this plan as to what specifically do you do. What we think may be valuable, and we've helped other groups do it, especially as we've helped Safe Routes to Schools program start, is just saying, here's what a programming calendar could look like for you. Here are the types of things that would be appropriate.
I think I'd say absolutely. If you're like, especially in our early meetings, before we got kind of off the ground with some of this planning, it was dominating a lot of our conversation. I think absolutely and yes.
Okay.
And one of the things that I had hoped to mention in this as well, forgive me, I don't want to interrupt you. I got one other thing I wanted to say here in number 4, when you're done. I just wanted to thank the people who have done a number of projects without us really talking about them a ton. I mean, even just the little stretch of sidewalk out here, the little bit in front of the town hall, these little 10 and 15 and 20 foot lengths of sidewalk and path, in my own observation, make a huge difference, not only for the image, but the actual practicality of being able to get around our town. And in my own life, one that mattered a whole lot was the about 50 or 100 feet of 500. So thanks to everybody who got that done, and I'm sure that some of what the feedback that you have collected influenced that. But I felt like I wanted to mention that, at least on the record, for anybody who might be listening or interested in it later. The projects here right around Town Hall have been pretty awesome. That's all I wanted to mention in miscellaneous.
Cool. Next steps. Let's talk about what this looks like from here. So we want to give you some additional materials here next week. And so we've taken a lot of the things that you've seen to this point and putting that down on paper and bringing this thing together. So we've got all of our existing conditions analysis done and written out. We want to start to show you what development standards, we want to start to look at what does that look like moving forward, how does that get incorporated into the plan, and really start to wrap up final edits on this map. So if you've got thoughts on this map, please take one last look at this, because moving forward from here, the long-term plan I don't want to change. Short-term action plan, that can still flex of what we do now versus later, but that long-term plan, we really want to start to finalize that. We'll have our next meeting, and we'll be starting to work on the draft at that point. So in between us getting you these materials finalized, we're going to start working on that draft. And depending on how far we get, we'll either be reviewing final input that we need from that draft, or maybe even have a little bit of that for you at that next meeting. So we've got the next meeting down as October 17th. Just want to make sure that works for everyone on the 17th.
I'll observe for folks here who are checking their calendars that it is during fall break, and I believe for all Boone County school districts.
Okay, well, let's find a different date then.
perhaps the 24th. I realize that's after your planned draft delivery.
Well, we can push it till after that, and that would be fine. That would give you a chance to take a look at it and work from there. I'm available the 24th. Yeah.
That's good because that's fall break.
24th is good for me.
Good for me as well.
Okay. Well, we'll get you this update, and then we will be looking at a first draft of this document on that at that next meeting. We won't have all the costs in there yet. We want to make sure we got the recommendations in there before we start putting real costs against too much of that. But we'll be starting with some of that. Appreciate the input tonight. Appreciate everybody coming out. It really is great to have everybody here for additional input on this. And I do request that we have a band at every public meeting from now on, because that really is so much better than other opportunities. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody who came out tonight, and such a large group of people. Mr. Messer's indicating he may have something else to share with us.
Well, since the Big Four keeps coming up, I did want to give an update on it. We had a meeting last week between Whitestown, Lebanon, Zionsville, and the county. We were all sitting in the conference room for about 2 hours and talking about how we get this done now. It is a county priority, county-wide priority, and we're looking at solutions. We're going to start meeting about once a month and look at finding a way to get the entire Big Four across Boone County as soon as possible. Instead of having these gaps, some county members realize that they have the gaps now, and we want to work together to come up with a solution. So yeah, we're starting to meet monthly to come up with that solution. So hopefully it'll get moving and we get this Big Four completed across Boone County.
Thank you for that initiative and for getting together with those. Thanks. Board members, anything else?
No.
I think we need a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And we stand.